All right, guys, sorry about that. I had a technical glitch, and so had to restart this recording. So this chapter will consist of two separate parts. My apologies for that. Anyway, let's continue where we left off. We were talking about difference between group selection, individual selection, all that sort of thing. So we had an example here on the left of group selection. All right, and oops, sorry. So group selection on the left favors the altruistic genotype. So we have these groups with different genotypes, right? These would be selfish genotypes. These would be altruistic. The idea that these populations that on the left that have selfish genotypes might, overconsume their resource base because everybody eats or consumes everything they possibly can. They're selfish, right? Might result in them going extinct. And that's what you see happening here as time goes on. The altruistic genotypes, those populations that have that or are characterized by that, the individuals would only consume what they needed, and those populations or groups would then survive longer. That's the idea behind group selection favoring the altruistic behavior. In the other case, on the right-hand side, within population selection, individual selection would tend to favor selfish genotypes, because here we're talking about selection that operates at a faster rate, individual selection. Individuals are born, reproduce, and die faster at higher rates than populations do. And so even though you may have populations being favored from an altruistic standpoint or a group selection standpoint, individuals within them are favored from a individual selection standpoint, and so you should expect that the individual selection to win out over time because the rate of replacement is faster. Essentially, the turnover is faster. All right, so we have this question, does group selection even exist then? So if group selection doesn't exist, how does one explain seemingly altruistic behavior like monkeys sounding alarm calls to warn their troop of a predator, or worker ants that do not reproduce but spend their lives laboring for their colony? Well, we have a possible explanation for that in the form of what's called kin selection. Okay, this may provide the answer. Kin selection occurs when individuals influence the reproductive success of their kin. So if an individual is altruistic in some way, it's more likely to be so toward its kin, its relatives, who are more likely to carry the same alleles as the altruist does. So when the altruist enhances the fitness of its kin, possibly even at a cost to its own fitness, it can increase the frequency of the allele. This explains a lot of observations in biology, like why parents risk their lives defending their young, why gay uncles are often good caregivers, etc. And that brings us then to the concept of species selection. All right, species selection for species. Selection favors in certain species and results in a correlation between a certain phenotypic feature and the rate of speciation or extinction. For example, lineages with a more extreme value of a character along some continuum of variation in that character may speciate faster and have a lower rate of extinction. Selection would favor those lineages and thus species within those lineages. All right. Sorry, here's my slide I need. I got ahead of myself. This is the figure that has to do with this. All right, if you look on the left, what we have here is time on our y-axis and the degree of variation in some morphological feature on the x, okay? In figure A on the left, we have a higher rate of speciation in these lineages on the right. New species produce faster than we do in those lineages on the left. So at some given time, say time 1, you look at the average value of some character, okay? Average value of some character, and maybe it falls out right about there on that x-axis. But then at a later time, because of the higher rate of speciation in the lineages here, the average value at this time shifted to the right. It's now further over here because you have more species that have that character, or extreme versions of it. So differential speciation, different rates of speciation in lineages, can result in a shift in the character over time. On the right-hand side, we have this happening a different way. Notice that these lineages, the vertical lines are shorter than on the right. That means these guys are going extinct faster, these guys are persisting longer. That can also result in a shift from left to right along that continuum of variation. So in both cases, the average character value becomes greater as time passes, okay? All right. So, species selection may explain why most species of organisms reproduce sexually rather than asexually. Asexual species, while being able to produce more offspring, exhibit less genetic variability than sexual species do, and selection would therefore seem to favor sexual species since they're more adaptable. In fact, most asexual species are very young in an evolutionary sense. They don't exist as long as sexual species do, and this might explain why most species today are sexually reproducing. Okay, next thing, let's talk about the nature of adaptations. So when we observe a feature, a character state, let's say, that an organism has, is it safe to assume it's an adaptation that arose through selection? Or does that feature exist due to the vagaries or contingencies, randomness of phylogenetic history? This is an important question. When Darwin discussed how the skull sutures of live-bearing mammals are so well suited to aid in the birth process by allowing the head to fit through the birth canal, he concluded that since sutures are present in egg-laying reptiles and birds that do not show live birth, the sutures must have been taken advantage of by mammals who evolved later to aid in their particular mode of reproduction. Skull sutures are therefore not an adaptation specifically for live birth, but evolved earlier, probably as a means for allowing the brain to grow following hatching from an egg. All right, so skull sutures, disregard that, in that sense are what's known as a pre-adaptation. So a pre-adaptation. This is a feature that evolves in one context but later becomes useful in another context, or takes on a different role later on. Sometimes these are referred to as exaptations as well. Okay, exaptations. So some good examples of exaptations or pre-adaptation. The wing of the murre, shown here on the left, and the wings of penguins shown here on the right. So both of these are swimming and diving birds. The murre, though, in addition to being able to, quote, fly underwater, is also capable of flying in air. So the wing is adapted for both flight ability in air and swimming underwater. It's multi-purpose, in other words. The wing of the penguin on the right is solely adapted for swimming in water. It's fully adapted to be a flipper. Okay, it used to be a wing, but now a flipper. But in both cases, we have a feature, a wing, originally adapted for flight, but being large surface area and relatively flat, also turns out to be fairly useful in water as a flipper, and so we see the wing now of these two birds as a pre-adaptation or an exaptation to moving underwater. All right, so why might a trait not be considered an adaptation? Well, there are basically four reasons for this. First, the character may have evolved by genetic drift, not by selection. You could have an allele that isn't necessarily a good thing to have that could go to fixation in the population by drift alone. So selection may have nothing to do with it. Selection might actually be working to eliminate it, but drift, because of its random nature, could cause it to go to fixation. That character the allele codes for could therefore not be considered an adaptation because it doesn't increase the fitness of the population. Second, the character may simply be a consequence of chemistry or physics. Plants are not green because it's adapted to be green. They're green because the structure of chlorophyll causes it to reflect green light. It's just a consequence of the structure of the molecule. It has no adaptive value. Third, the character may be correlated with a feature that is adaptive. We talked about genetic hitchhiking in a previous chapter. You have a gene that's located in a certain spot on a chromosome. It's being selected for. It's adaptive. Another gene right below it, very close to it, may have no adaptive value or is not being selected for. But because it's close to the gene that's being selected for, and therefore not likely to be separated through a crossover event during meiosis, it could end up being pulled in the future at higher rates in the same way the gene is being selected for is because it's close to it. That's called genetic hitchhiking. And so the character that results from that gene might not be an adaptation. Selection might actually be working against it, but it's being sort of swamped by selection favoring the other gene it's close to. Who knows? Fourth, the character may be a result of phylogenetic history. So the mammal skull sutures are a good example of that. They are not an adaptation for large brains specifically. They were originally an adaptation for allowing the head to fit, or allowing the brain to grow after development, or after birth, rather. So, how do we determine then if a structure is actually an adaptation? What kinds of things do we look for? Well, the first thing we look for is evidence of complexity. Does the structure show complexity? If it shows complexity, that suggests selection moving that structure in the direction of becoming more complex over time, consistently. Okay, features that are complex likely evolve through selection, since it is the only evolutionary force that can craft complex structures. Great example of that is the pecten of a bird's retina. So all birds have this. It's this peculiar feature that you see here that sort of juts off of the base of the retina, and it's this sort of membranous structure, highly convoluted, that juts out into the vitreous humor, the fluid that you see inside the bird's eye. Lots of people have proposed explanations for this. The most common one you see today, since no one really knows, is that it's involved in nutrient absorption from the vitreous humor. No one's really sure, but it certainly is complex, and you see it in all birds. That suggests it's an adaptation. 2, do we see design or functionality? Okay, so design or functionality. All right, so look at the leaves that you see on plants in the tropics. Very often, either they are composed of very, very small leaflets, like you see here, or the leaves are very large, broad, and flat, like on banana palms, but they tear along fracture or suture lines. In both cases, we have a leaf structure overall that is very uneven and disconnected, and so that results in the disruption of the boundary layer of still hot air against the leaf surface, which helps the leaf to dump off heat, helps the plant from overheating, which could reduce rates of photosynthesis and all sorts of things. So we see this across the board in lots of different species of plants, particularly in the tropics, and it does suggest design or functionality. So leaf structure might well be adaptive in that sense. Third, we can determine if something is an adaptation through experimentation. All right, so experimentation, testing whether or not a character results in higher fitness compared to individuals that don't have the feature or that have a different phenotypic form of the feature. Very often this is done in bacteria because you can easily insert genes, knock out genes, see what the effect on fitness is in terms of reproduction, because they reproduce so quickly. Fourth, we have the comparative method. So here we're comparing features present in multiple species resulting from convergent evolution. This allows for identification of function through determination of the selection pressure it's correlated with in various environments of different species. A good example of this, the large ears of desert mammals. Wherever you look in deserts around the world, in Asia, South America, North America, wherever, Africa, you see desert species, desert mammals in particular, that very often have large ears. Why? Well, the large ear, with a lot of blood pumping through it, acts as a radiator. Lots of surface area for that blood to dump off heat to the environment, and it's a way for the animals to thermoregulate in a hot environment to keep cool. You see the reverse is true in cold environments. Mammals there tend to have very, very small ears because the ear dumps off a lot of heat. The smaller the ear, the less heat it dumps off. It's the reverse of the desert situation. So when you see something like that across the board in a lot of different environments that are similar to each other in different parts of the world, that suggests it has adaptive value, and that suggests it's an adaptation. All right. Last part of this chapter to talk about our misconceptions about selection and adaptation. So first misconception is that adaptation always occurs to prevent extinction. That is not always true. Environmental change may not result in an increased likelihood of extinction, but may still create new selection pressures that result in change in some feature. Likewise, adaptations may also occur in static or unchanging environments if new mutations are superior to pre-existing genetic variation. So in both cases, you have a population that might be, very well adapted, But random mutation could result in a slightly better version of a gene, and selection will favor it. So producing, better adaptation. It's not necessarily as a result of a population being at extreme risk of extinction, for example. It's an example of nature sort of fine-tuning, or natural selection fine-tuning a population that's already fairly well adapted. 2, this misconception of perfection. Adaptations are never perfect. A perfectly adapted organism would be immortal and capable of producing an infinite number of offspring. Think about it. What is the biological purpose of life? Maximizing lifetime reproductive success. A perfectly adapted species would have to be immortal in that sense and be able to produce an infinite number of offspring. And that species just does not exist. Never has, never will. Selection can only act on mutations that happen to occur in a population. New variants often also are constrained in some way so that they fail to reach perfection. A good example of that. A new mutation may increase clutch size in birds, but only to the extent parents can feed more chicks. So there are always trade-offs, right, between competing factors or forces. 3, the fallacy of natural definitions of morality and ethics. Evolutionary theory cannot be employed to determine what is moral or ethical in human behavior. Selection describes only differences in reproductive success among individuals or genes, so it can't be described as, can it be described as ethical or unethical, moral or immoral, fair or unfair? The answer is no. Darwin was actually very concerned that people might corrupt his ideas to justify social inequality, racism, genocide, etc. Survival of the fittest, right? This was the basis of the social Darwinism movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Social Darwinism was the belief that natural selection was a constructive law of nature with the power to produce social progress due to struggle between individuals, ethnicities, races, nations, etc. Adolf Hitler subscribed to this philosophy, obviously, and that tells you something about it. Social Darwinism was the ultimate manifestation of what's known as the naturalistic fallacy. That what is natural is necessarily good. Morality and ethics are human constructs. No evidence for the existence of nature has ever been found by any field of scientific research. As your author of your book effectively states, science describes only what is, not what ought to be. All right, guys, that is the end then of chapter 2. Sorry it's in 2 parts, but it is what it is. We're all learning here, right? Okay.